I thought the hardest part was picking out the casket. I was wrong. 3 days after burying my husband of 32 years, I found a letter hidden inside his wallet, a letter that wasn't from me. It spoke of a promise broken and a terrifying deadline. Who was this promise to? And what catastrophic event would be unleashed tonight if I didn't find the original marriage contract? Before we go to the full story, please tell me from where you are watching. Tell me in comments, like the video and subscribe for more videos. The scent of death was still thick in the air, a heavy, cloying perfume of lilies and unspoken grief, 3 days after we laid my George into the cold, damp earth. I, Aaliyah Mae Johnson, a woman who had shared 32 years, 2 children, and countless secrets with George, was now performing the morbid ritual of clearing out his wallet, the thick, worn leather feeling impossibly cold in my hands. The sight of his driver's license, the smile too bright, the eyes too alive, brought a fresh wave of tears, but the grief was quickly replaced by a cold, searing shock when I reached the billfold. Tucked away, meticulously folded and creased, was a small, cream-colored letter, addressed to no one, and sealed with a heavy, dark wax, stamped with a seal I had never seen before, a coiled serpent eating its own tail. The seal, an Ouroboros, symbolized eternity and self-consumption, and it felt like a direct comment on the cyclical lies of my marriage. George never sealed personal letters. He was a man of straightforward, professional correspondence. My hands trembled as I carefully broke the wax, the sound sharp and final in the silent house. Inside, the paper was thick, expensive, and the handwriting was a delicate, looping script, distinctly feminine, yet utterly unfamiliar. The letter was short, but every word was a stab. The promise is broken, but the legacy remains. You owe us the truth about the child, George, and the time for payment is here. If Aaliyah finds the original marriage contract, everything ends. Tonight. The reference to the child sent a paralyzing jolt through me. George and I had 2 children, Michael and Sophia, both grown and happily launched. Was this about an illegitimate child? A hidden adoption? The note was dated the day before his heart attack, turning his death from a natural tragedy into a sudden, high-stakes emergency, suggesting he died right as this terrifying confrontation was about to begin. The mention of an original marriage contract was equally devastating. We had a clear, current, mutual will, but this hinted at a secret, older legal document that could invalidate our entire life together and leave me with nothing. I felt the familiar burn of fury, hotter than any grief, knowing I had been living a lie, a supporting actress in a drama George controlled until his last breath. My eyes darted around the silent living room, suddenly seeing the antique grandfather clock, a piece George adored, not as a timekeeper, but as a potential hiding place, realizing that the clock had stopped at exactly 1:47 a.m., the exact time George had died in the hospital, a detail I had tragically overlooked until this very moment, making the clock less of a symbol and more of a synchronized warning. I moved toward the clock, the thick carpet muffling my steps, feeling the need to break its silence and uncover the truth it guarded, realizing that the clock's non-functioning state was a deliberate, final act of concealment. I pressed firmly on the ornate wooden carving near the base, remembering George's strange fascination with hidden mechanisms and his cryptic remark about time stopping for a reason. The wood gave way with a faint, almost inaudible click, revealing a dark, small recess behind the clock's pendulum. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not a key, but a sealed, thick envelope addressed to Keisha Thorne, my son's wife, a woman I thought I loved, instantly elevating the mystery from George's potential infidelity to a carefully orchestrated family betrayal. The adrenaline surged, confirming my deepest fear. Keisha was not just a grieving daughter-in-law, she was now the central player in a drama of George's making, and she had been poised to strike the moment he was gone. What shocking knowledge did Keisha possess, and what was George's final message to her? The fear for my children's safety, now inextricably linked to this hidden conspiracy, became a paralyzing reality, forcing me to recognize that my daughter-in-law, a member of my own family, was the primary suspect in a plot that had roots decades deep, leaving me alone to confront a professional enemy hiding behind a loving smile. The letter, still clutched in my hand, provided a chilling, final instruction about the child that could only be deciphered by opening the sealed note intended for Keisha, making the decision to break that seal an act of absolute necessity. The thick, sealed envelope addressed to Keisha felt like a solid brick of deception in my hand, a final, lethal inheritance from my supposedly devoted husband. I knew breaking the seal was an irreversible step, a full declaration of war against the woman who had married my son, but the safety of Michael and Sophia outweighed any misplaced loyalty to my dead husband's secrets. With a decisive, savage tear, I ripped open the envelope. The contents were not a letter, but a heavily protected, official certificate, a notarized document detailing the adoption of Keisha Thorne exactly 30 years ago, the year George and I married. The devastating truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. Keisha was not only George's biological daughter, given up for adoption, but she was Michael's half-sister, and they were legally married. My vision blurred, the text swimming before my eyes, the reality of the toxic, incestuous secret threatening to consume my sanity. The betrayal was absolute, genetically damning, and meticulously planned. But the shock wasn't over. Tucked beneath the adoption papers was a small, tarnished safety deposit box key, clearly belonging to a downtown vault, along with a handwritten note from George, Aaliyah, "If you find this, Keisha knows. The contract is the key to her mother's silence. Use this key to retrieve the original." The key wasn't for the original marriage contract that threatened my finances, it was for the original blackmail agreement, the Thorne promise, that George had used to buy the silence of Keisha's biological mother, a woman named Eleanor Thorne. I realized that George had feared Keisha would discover the adoption and use it for revenge, but the real blackmailer was her mother, Eleanor, who was extorting George for 3 decades, using her daughter's identity as leverage. This changed everything. Keisha was not the villain, but potentially the pawn in her biological mother's wicked game, a game George had played until the very end. The safety deposit key, stamped with the logo of George's previous law firm, felt cold and heavy in my palm. The threat of tonight was real. Eleanor was likely preparing to release the adoption secret to the press, destroying Michael's life and my family's legacy unless I complied with the terms of the blackmail agreement, terms I did not yet know. I raced to the firm, using George's old access card. The building was empty, silent, smelling faintly of lemon polish and ambition. I found the private vault deep in the basement archives, and the key fit perfectly. Inside, nestled in the box, was a single audio cassette tape labeled, "The Thorne Promise, 1995. An audio recording? Why an audio tape? I fumbled to find an old cassette player in George's empty office, and as the tape began to whir, a chilling, formal voice, distinctly feminine, began to speak. "George, you agree to these terms, financial support for Keisha until she marries, in exchange for my perpetual silence regarding the truth of the divorce." The tape wasn't about the adoption, it was about George's divorce from me, Aaliyah, a divorce I had never signed, a divorce I never knew about, revealing that George and I were never actually married, but had been living a lie under a forged marriage license for 30 years, making the entire foundation of my life a sophisticated, legally binding fraud. The sudden, devastating realization that I was not George's legal wife, that our 32 years of marriage had been a complex, legally fraudulent performance orchestrated by George and Eleanor Thorne, left me reeling, the audio tape's revelation echoing like a final, mocking verdict in the deserted office. The original marriage contract was the forged divorce document that Eleanor had helped George create to cement their blackmail agreement. But the tape was still playing, and the next voice was a shock. It was Michael's voice, thin and anxious, recorded years ago. "Dad, I can't believe Eleanor would make us do this. Are you sure Keisha won't find out?" George's stern reply followed, "She never will, son. But this will protect us from the police inquiry." My son, my sweet Michael, was not just an unwitting pawn, he had been involved in the conspiracy, somehow helping George finalize the fraudulent divorce, but the mention of a police inquiry suggested the cover-up was far larger than just a fake divorce. The audio tape was a chilling, sequential confession of the family's crimes, a meticulously preserved record of George's deception. I continued to listen, desperate for the full, terrible truth. The tape then jumped forward, the audio becoming muffled, recording a heated argument between George and Eleanor, who was demanding more money. Eleanor's voice, cold and ruthless, suddenly said, "It was bad enough you let Michael drive the car that hit Fiona, but covering up the body was the final straw, George. You're mine now." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Eleanor Thorne wasn't just a blackmailer, she was the mother of Fiona Thorne, the victim of a hit-and-run George and Michael had covered up 30 years ago. Keisha, Michael's wife/half-sister, was Fiona's younger sister. The child was Keisha, and the promise was to support her family in exchange for silence about the murder. Michael drove the car that killed his wife's sister, and George disposed of the body, using the fraudulent divorce and blackmail to ensure silence. The toxic web of family secrets was now complete, a masterpiece of devastation woven by George. I had to find a way to dismantle the conspiracy before Eleanor released the evidence tonight. I grabbed the audio cassette, intent on destroying the final proof, but as I stood, my eye caught a faint shimmer of light reflecting from the firm's shredder bin, a pile of shredded paper that George had meticulously tried to destroy before he died. I pulled out a handful, pieces of torn documents, and began the painstaking, desperate work of reconstruction. The paper fragments were from a bank deposit slip, dated 2 days before his death, detailing a massive withdrawal, a final blackmail payment. But the name of the recipient was the shock. The withdrawal was made out to a personal account held by Detective Reynolds, the lead investigator on George's death, revealing the most unpredictable and terrifying twist of all. The police officer investigating George's death was not just compromised, but an active, paid participant in the 30-year cover-up, and he knew I was digging, making him the most immediate and professional danger. The chilling realization that Detective Reynolds, the man I had trusted and consulted with since George's death, was actively involved in the 30-year conspiracy and was being paid off by my dead husband, turned my grief into a cold, paralyzing terror. I raced out of the archive and ran through the empty streets, the audio cassette and the shredded deposit slip burning in my hand. My destination was Keisha and Michael's house. I needed to warn Michael before the police inquiry, now controlled by Reynolds, closed in. I slipped into their home, the silence thick with the unspoken fear Michael must have been experiencing. I found Keisha in the master bedroom, not packing or fleeing, but meticulously cleaning out George's old briefcase, which he had left in their care. She looked up, her eyes wide, not with panic, but with a strange, fierce determination. "Aaliyah," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "I know about the adoption. George told me everything. He told me I was his daughter." The shock of her calm confession momentarily threw me, but her next words brought the full, horrifying picture into focus. "He also told me he left the original marriage contract, the real one, the one proving he married my mother, Eleanor, before he married you, with the only person he trusted to keep it safe, Detective Reynolds." The twist was staggering. George didn't just forge a divorce from me. He had bigamously married Eleanor Thorne years before me, making Eleanor his true, legal wife, and Keisha his legitimate daughter. My entire marriage had been a lie built on George's first legal relationship. I wasn't just not his wife, I was the other woman, and my children were technically illegitimate. Keisha's revenge wasn't for abandonment, but for the destruction of her biological family and her sister's death. But Keisha's eyes suddenly darted past me, fixed on the hallway, her face draining of all color. "Aaliyah, he's here. I think he followed you." I spun around, my blood running cold, and saw a figure silhouetted against the kitchen window, moving with a familiar, authoritative gait. It wasn't Reynolds, it was Michael. He burst into the room, not panicked, but furious, clutching a large, dark red ledger. "You found the letters, Mom," Michael hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You were supposed to find them. Keisha was supposed to find them. The money stops with Dad's death, and now we control the final truth. He wasn't a victim, he was an accomplice, working with Keisha and Eleanor to secure the money. The original marriage contract is a lie, Aaliyah," Michael confessed, his eyes cold and hard. The truth is in this ledger. Dad didn't cover up the hit and run, he covered up the murder of Eleanor Thorne. The final, paralyzing shock sent me reeling. George hadn't died of a heart attack, he had murdered Keisha's mother, his real wife, years ago, and the blackmail was a pact between Michael, Keisha, and the now-dead Eleanor's accomplice, Reynolds, to ensure George's total silence and financial compliance. Michael then pointed to the window. "We know Reynolds is coming. He's here to destroy the ledger." I looked, and through the glass, I saw a familiar car pull up, Detective Reynolds, stepping out, a phone to his ear, his expression grim, confirming the deadly double-cross. I had to choose, save my son and daughter-in-law, the murderers, or expose the entire plot and risk my own life by grabbing the ledger. I lunged for the heavy ledger, knowing it held the secrets to Eleanor's murder, and as my fingers grasped the leather, a sudden, blinding flash erupted from the kitchen, a gunshot. The sound of the gunshot, sharp, deafening, and final, reverberated through the silent house, instantly elevating the family betrayal into a full-scale homicide investigation, and I instinctively dropped to the floor, pulling Michael down with me, the heavy, dark red ledger clutched against my chest. The bullet, thankfully, had struck the wall behind us, showering us with plaster dust, proving the shooter was aiming to eliminate the evidence. Not just threaten us. Keisha, surprisingly, did not flinch. She was already scrambling to the floor, her eyes fixed not on the window, but on the ledger in my hands. "Give me the ledger, Aaliyah. It exposes the real killer, not my mother," she hissed, her voice laced with desperation, suggesting that the murder plot was even more convoluted than I realized. I refused, clutching the leather tighter. "You're all lying. Who fired that shot?" Michael, lying beside me, pointed a trembling finger at the window. "It's Eleanor. She's not dead, Mom. She faked her death years ago to escape the law, and she's been controlling all of us from the shadows, using Keisha and me as pawns, using George's will as the leverage to finalize her escape." The twist was paralyzing. George hadn't murdered Eleanor Thorne. He had helped her fake her own death to escape a different crime, a crime now tied to the fortune. Eleanor was the one who had murdered Fiona, her sister, and George, obsessed with his daughter Keisha, had protected Eleanor to keep Keisha close. The blackmail was Eleanor's way of controlling her assets and ensuring her safety in hiding. The ledger contained the financial proof of her fake death and the hit-and-run cover-up. The person who fired the shot was Eleanor, the ultimate ghost in the machine, returning to secure the ledger and silence all witnesses. Just then, the front door burst open, and Detective Reynolds stormed in, his gun drawn. He wasn't aiming at us, he was scanning the kitchen window, confirming the presence of the shooter. "She's here, Michael. She knows I'm after the ledger." Reynolds yelled, his loyalty to Michael now confirmed, proving he wasn't a conspirator but a counteragent working with George to expose Eleanor. The ledger, now opened by the force of the fall, revealed a single, large, cryptic entry on the final page, "ED final payment. Account 404. Key is not the money. The key is the final will." The entry immediately linked back to the safety deposit box key I found, suggesting George had left a final, legitimate will hidden in that bank box that would expose Eleanor's criminal empire and the true extent of her identity. I had to get back to the bank. I lunged for the front door, dodging Reynolds who was now returning fire through the kitchen, and sprinted out into the dark night, the heavy ledger feeling like a painful, yet necessary, anchor. As I reached the end of the driveway, a figure emerged from the shadows of the neighboring house, a woman with familiar, cold eyes and a severe expression. It was Eleanor Thorne herself, the woman who had faked her own death, holding a smoking pistol. She was blocking my escape, her face set in a cold, determined mask of lethal intent, and her voice, thick with menace, cut through the night. "The ledger is mine, Aaliyah. And so is the final will." Eleanor Thorne, the woman who had successfully faked her own death and had been orchestrating the destruction of my family from the shadows, now stood before me, blocking my escape, her eyes burning with lethal intent, confirming the horrifying truth that the real mastermind was alive and willing to commit murder to secure the ledger. The smoking pistol in her hand was a terrifyingly efficient deterrent, and I knew that negotiating with her was futile. She was a criminal sociopath whose sole focus was self-preservation and the protection of her vast, illicit fortune. I frantically looked for an escape route, but the street was empty, and the sound of police sirens, faint but growing, told me Reynolds was already calling for backup, buying me precious, minimal time. "You don't want this, Eleanor," I pleaded, holding the heavy ledger up like a shield, knowing the evidence it contained was the only thing protecting me. "George is dead. The fortune is yours. Why are you risking everything for a piece of paper?" Eleanor laughed, a high, brittle, cold sound that held no humor. "The fortune is nothing without the ownership deed, Aaliyah. The ledger proves I own the entire company, not George, and the final will reveals the location of the deed. George hid both to protect Keisha and Michael from my enemies." Her confession was a crippling twist. George hadn't been covering up murder. He had been protecting his daughter and my son from Eleanor's vast, dangerous criminal empire, an empire she built after faking her death. The hit and run was merely a cover story to ensure George's silence and emotional compliance. The real threat wasn't Eleanor, but her powerful, unknown enemies who would destroy Michael and Keisha to get the deed. I realized that George's death was not a heart attack but a premeditated murder orchestrated by Eleanor herself because he was about to expose her to the police. I had to find the final will, not just for my safety, but for my children's lives. I used the split second of Eleanor's distraction to pivot sharply and hurl the heavy ledger across the street, throwing it into the path of the oncoming police cars, creating a massive, visible obstruction. The sound of the ledger hitting the asphalt was immediately followed by a screech of tires as the first police car swerved to avoid it, its lights flashing wildly. Eleanor screamed in pure, professional rage, momentarily fractured by the loss of the physical evidence, her attention fixed on the street. I used the distraction, bolting into the thick, dark cover of the neighbor's yard, running toward the only safe haven I could think of, the one person George trusted to receive the final will, Sophia, my daughter. As I ran, a sudden movement in the shadows of the neighbor's porch caught my attention. Standing perfectly still, watching the chaotic scene unfold with unnerving calm, was a figure in a dark uniform. It wasn't a police officer, it was a private security guard, one who worked for George's company, a guard I had seen patrolling our home in the days before George died. The final, terrifying realization hit me. This guard wasn't protecting George. He was Eleanor's personal enforcer, placed there to monitor George's movements and ensure his silence, revealing that the entire family had been under surveillance for months, and now the enforcer had witnessed my escape and was coming for me, making the police the least of my worries. The sight of the private security guard, Eleanor's silent enforcer, confirming that I had been under surveillance all along, injected a terrifying, professional layer of danger into my flight. My heart hammered against my ribs, and the knowledge that I was being hunted by a trained operative who was not bound by police procedure was paralyzing. I ignored the sirens, the chaos behind me, focusing solely on the escape to Sophia's apartment. My daughter, a kind, brilliant young woman, was the last person anyone would suspect of holding a deadly secret. I burst into her apartment building, rushing up the stairs, knowing I had mere minutes before the enforcer tracked my movements. I found Sophia at home, curled up on the couch, watching television, her face pale with worry. She looked up, her eyes wide with shock. "Mom! What are you doing here? You're covered in dust." I stumbled into the living room, gasping for breath, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "Sophia, your father, he's a bigamist. Keisha is your half-sister. And your mother-in-law, Eleanor, is alive, she murdered her sister, and she's coming for you because you have the final will." Sophia, surprisingly, did not collapse in shock. Instead, her face hardened, her expression turning into a grim mask of resolve that mirrored George's. She walked over to her bookshelf and pulled out a worn, heavy copy of The History of the Thorn Corporation, a book George had always insisted she keep. She opened the book, revealing a deep, hollowed-out compartment, and pulled out a rolled-up scroll of paper, tied with a black satin ribbon. "I know, Mom," she said, her voice steady and controlled. "Dad told me everything before he died. He knew Eleanor would kill him. This is the final true will. It names Keisha and me as the sole, legitimate beneficiaries, effectively cutting Eleanor out and collapsing her criminal network." The shock was profound. My daughter wasn't just safe, she was George's final, willing accomplice in the takedown of his former legal wife. The final will is only activated when it's presented to the Thorn Corporation's board of directors, Sophia explained, looking at her watch. Dad's death triggers the emergency board meeting. It's happening in 1 hour. We have to get there. The pieces of George's grand plan clicked into place. His death was a deliberate sacrifice, designed to trigger the board meeting and allow the will to be presented, ensuring Eleanor's final, crushing defeat, revealing the deepest layer of his betrayal. He had planned his own demise, making me a grieving widow to hide his strategy. But the shock wasn't over. As Sophia was explaining the final details, a low, guttural noise came from the kitchen. We both froze, realizing the enforcer had found us. The kitchen door slowly began to open, and the shadowy figure of the private security guard stepped into the hallway, his face cold and expressionless. He wasn't holding a gun, but a small, black, leather-bound journal, George's private diary. "Mrs. Johnson, Miss Johnson," the guard said, his voice surprisingly deep and cultured. "Eleanor sends her regards. But she requires this diary. It contains the real truth about Sophia's father." The final, unbelievable twist hit me with paralyzing force. The security guard wasn't just an enforcer. He was the one holding the most devastating secret, and he was here to expose a new layer of betrayal that George hadn't even confessed to in his death plan. The security guard's revelation that George's private diary held the real truth about Sophia's father sent a sickening wave of dread through me, momentarily eclipsing the danger of Eleanor's pursuit. My mind raced through two possibilities: either the guard was lying, a final attempt by Eleanor to destabilize us, or George had a secret even more devastating than the bigamy and the murder cover-up. I looked at Sophia, whose face was a mask of cold fury, her hands clutching the final true will tightly. "My father is George, you maniac." Sophia spat, her voice ringing with defiance. The guard simply smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. He opened the diary and read a single, short entry, dated 1995. "Today, I secured the last paperwork. Sophia will never know that her biological father, my brother Elijah, died bankrupt and disgraced, and that I took her in as my own. Aaliyah will never know the full extent of my promise to my sister-in-law." The revelation was a cataclysmic, personal betrayal that shattered my identity as a mother. Sophia was not George's biological daughter, but his niece, the child of his dead brother, Elijah, whom George had raised as his own to spare me the pain of the truth and to protect his sister-in-law from disgrace. The promise was to his sister-in-law, not Eleanor Thorne, confirming that George's life was a labyrinth of self-sacrificing lies built on a foundation of profound secrecy. The tears that finally came were not tears of grief or fear, but of agonizing, personal disillusionment at the sheer weight of George's deceptions, realizing I had never truly known the man I loved. I knew then that the only way to expose the entire web of lies was to use George's own final weapon. "The diary is meaningless now," I declared, my voice trembling but firm. "The final will is about to be presented. You're too late." The guard, visibly shaken by my composure, suddenly lunged forward, not for the will, but towards Sophia's laptop, which was sitting open on the coffee table. "The digital backup. She needs the digital backup," he roared, grabbing the laptop and smashing it violently against the edge of the table, shattering the screen and destroying the final, digital copy of the will. The shock was the guard's true motive. He wasn't there to steal the paper will. He was there to destroy the immutable, digital evidence. The paper will, I realized, could be easily dismissed as a forgery, but the digital timestamp and metadata were the only things the board would accept. The guard's act of sabotage had just neutralized George's entire takedown plan. We were back to square one, trapped, and more vulnerable than ever. Suddenly, the sirens, which had been approaching, stopped directly outside the building. A loud, official voice boomed from the street, "This is the police. We have secured a perimeter. Detective Reynolds is in charge." The guard, realizing he was trapped, threw the broken laptop at me and bolted for the back door. As I watched him disappear, the terror was replaced by a cold, strategic fury. I clutched the paper will, knowing it was now just a piece of paper, useless without the digital proof. I had to find an immediate, desperate way to transfer the will's information before Reynolds, or Eleanor, reached us. I looked at Sophia, and an impossible plan formed in my mind. "Sophia," I whispered, holding the will toward her, "you're going to have to memorize every single detail. We need to destroy this paper and expose the truth verbally at the board meeting." The only way to win was to incinerate the last piece of physical evidence and trust my daughter's photographic memory, committing the ultimate act of trust in a life full of betrayal. I ran to the fireplace, ignoring Sophia's frantic protests, and held the scroll over the dying embers, a new, terrifying reality dawning. The final will would be destroyed, but the truth would live on in Sophia's mind. The instantaneous decision to incinerate the final true will, George's last, desperate weapon, was a terrifying act of faith, a final rejection of the written contract in favor of the human memory. The paper caught fire quickly, curling and blackening, the crisp smoke filling the apartment with the scent of burning secrets, forcing Sophia to frantically scan the scrolling text, committing every single clause and beneficiary detail to memory. She was weeping, but her eyes were fixed and furious, burning the data into her mind. My heart ached for the impossible burden I was placing on her, but it was the only way to beat the professional saboteurs who targeted the physical evidence. The final entry on the will, just before it turned to ash, was a chilling addendum. The only person who truly knows Eleanor's real location and the full scope of the financial fraud is Keisha, my daughter. The revelation was stunning. Keisha was not a mere pawn or accomplice. She was George's confidant, the one he trusted to hold the deepest, darkest secrets about her own mother's criminal life, and she was the only one who could verify Sophia's verbal testimony to the board. The fire alarm began to wail, adding to the deafening chaos. I grabbed Sophia and pulled her toward the window, ready to make a final, desperate escape. Just then, the front door splintered inward with a savage crash, and Detective Reynolds stormed in, his eyes blazing with fury, his attention fixed on the smoke and the ashes in the fireplace. "Where is the will, Aaliyah? You fool! You've destroyed the only proof," he roared, confirming that he was genuinely trying to protect the evidence. But his next action was the true shock. He wasn't alone. Standing behind him, her face a mask of cold, triumphant malice, was Eleanor Thorne, her gun now aimed not at me, but at Reynolds. "He was working for George, Aaliyah. He betrayed me," Eleanor hissed, her voice low and venomous. "I killed George because he was ready to expose my criminal network and give everything to Keisha and Sophia. And now, I will take out my biggest threat." The twist was complete and utterly devastating. Reynolds was the protector, and Eleanor was the murderer, the true orchestrator of all the chaos. Before Eleanor could fire, a figure burst into the apartment from the outside balcony, shattering the remaining glass. It was Keisha. She landed lightly, her eyes immediately finding mine. "It's over, Eleanor. I know the code to your offshore account, the one Dad gave me. It exposes everything." Keisha wasn't just George's confidant, she was the final failsafe, armed with the evidence needed to collapse her mother's empire. Eleanor's attention snapped from Reynolds to Keisha, her pistol shifting, a look of pure, murderous rage crossing her face. "You traitorous child. You'll never tell them the code," she screamed, raising the gun. The silence that followed was broken only by the sharp, terrifying crack of a single shot, a sound that sealed the fate of one of the women in the room, forcing me to stare into the smoking muzzle of the weapon, paralyzed, wondering whose life had just been violently extinguished. The single, deafening gunshot ripped through the apartment, followed by the sound of a body hitting the floor with a sickening, heavy thud. The smoke from the fireplace mingled with the acrid scent of gunpowder, creating a horrifying, cinematic haze. I scrambled forward, terrified, my eyes frantically searching the chaotic scene. It wasn't Keisha, nor was it Eleanor. It was Detective Reynolds, his body slumped against the wall, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had grazed him. He had lunged forward to intercept the bullet aimed at Keisha, sacrificing his own safety to protect George's final legacy, confirming his absolute dedication to the deceased man's cause. Eleanor, furious at the misfire, turned the gun back toward Keisha, but before she could aim, Keisha's voice rang out, clear and defiant, cutting through the escalating tension. "I already transmitted the code, Mother. The board has it. The police are already seizing the assets. It's over." The statement was a powerful, final victory, the ultimate defeat of Eleanor's criminal empire, orchestrated by her own daughter. Eleanor's expression shifted from rage to a cold, frightening resignation. She lowered the gun, her eyes sweeping over the devastated room, the blood, the shattered glass, the ashes of the will, the three women who had endured her decade-long reign of terror. She then looked directly at me, Aaliyah, and her voice dropped to a low, chilling whisper, revealing the one, true final secret George had died for. "George didn't die of a heart attack, Aaliyah. He was murdered. But not by me. He was murdered by the enforcer, the security guard. He works for the Russian syndicate, my rivals, who knew George was planning this takeover. They killed George to prevent the board meeting, and they set me up to take the fall. The enforcer has the final piece of evidence, the murder weapon, and he's delivering it to the syndicate right now." The final, catastrophic shock was the deepest cut of all. George was murdered by a third, unknown criminal entity, and the enforcer, the man who knew Sophia's true parentage, was the actual killer, currently fleeing with the proof, ensuring the real criminals would walk free. The family drama had exploded into an international conspiracy, and the man who killed my husband was still at large. Keisha, seeing the look of devastation on my face, rushed toward me, taking my hand. "We have to go, Aaliyah. The police are here, and the enforcer is getting away." We ran out of the apartment, leaving Reynolds to tend his wound, Keisha guiding me toward the back stairs. The sirens were deafening now, surrounding the building, but as we burst out onto the chaotic street, I saw a familiar dark figure in the distance, the enforcer, jumping into a waiting black sedan, the sleek car speeding away into the city traffic, the murder weapon and the final secret gone with him. My family was safe, financially secure, but the man who killed George, the true villain in this dark, complex story, had escaped into the night, leaving me with the knowledge that the greatest betrayal was not the lies George told, but the lethal truth he was killed trying to protect, a truth that was still waiting to be revealed, forcing me to confront the reality that the war was not over.